Why am I making this lazy, substanceless content? A tips video? Really? These are already so overdone, despite Dragon Quest 3 HD only being out for like a week, and they are always terrible. Number 1. Status effects work on most bosses, but they function slightly different from how they usually do in the series. For one, their duration depends on the type of enemy you use them on. If you put a boss to sleep, they will wake up immediately. In the old games, this would have allowed them to act right away, but in this one, enemies either act or don't. There's no waking up in the middle of a turn and still getting an action. This also results in single turn stunts like tongue bashing or leg sweep having a lot more utility than they used to have. If you apply turn skip to an enemy that gets to act twice, that means you trade one of your 4 actions for all of theirs. In practice, this makes party members like thieves without much else to do in a fight quite useful. If they're going first, using a snooze stuff will take away the whole turn if it hits. Just be careful when going after the boss, since if they wake up before the turn is over, for example when they get hit by any attack, even non-physical ones in this game, they will get all their actions next turn. And in that case, you would have wasted your time. In these instances, status effects like leg sweep have an edge. I hope you learned something new from this. These are strats that you can apply in practice. You know, I watched a whole lot of tips videos that were released in the last few days. I read a lot of the written up lists and I didn't like them all that much. A lot of the tips were stuff that you could come up with at a first glance without any context. A lot of what's thrown around is applicable to any RPG, derived not from experience but common sense. Almost all the tips I've seen could have been written without ever playing the game. The advice to give all seeds to the main character, to protect your healer, to always use a heal. Number 2. Party building is much more open-ended than you might think, even when playing quote-unquote optimally. The first thing I want to debunk is that a priest is required for the early game. You can not only get through the early game, but I'd make the argument that going without a dedicated healer is even easier and better in the long run. The reason I believe that is that early game enemies are squishy and you can reasonably clear them out before they act. Instead of healing after the fact, you can prevent damage by killing all the enemies first. So you take less damage, need less healing, and therefore the hero is more than capable of keeping up the entire party's health. Especially since level ups are frequent early on and they refill your HP and MP. But if you then add in medicinal herbs which you can buy in bulk and their stronger variants, that makes a priest almost redundant, and having one makes battles drag on a little bit more. The later sections do get easier if you have a healer, but by that I mean content long after reclassing, and by then you can reclass into a priest or sage. The long-term value of starting as a priest and reclassing to something else is not that big, since no matter what you end up making, having mid-heal or Zin as a last resort is much worse than instead putting strong herbs on a party member with better stats or abilities that help you in other ways like pet food, snoop or even wild side. Something I often hear recommended is priest into sage, but a priest that reclass to sage is way worse than a thief that reclass to sage. Priest is one of those classes that you only go into for the abilities. But in general, I don't like talking about only end results because that's ignoring the whole game. And despite all I said, there is some value to a priest. Zap for one is useful for physically oriented parties and becomes borderline mandatory against some late game bosses. But I wanted to use this to get to a wider point. You can make all sorts of parties and not only get away with it, but even be efficient. More efficient than the standard warrior, priest and mage lineup. Don't let your creativity in party building be restricted by someone telling you that you need a priest or that you need either a priest or a monster wrangler as a healer, since in fact you don't need any healer besides the hero early on. Priests aren't terrible, but if you feel like going for 2 monster wranglers and a thief or whatever, well, you don't have to let your dreams die for the convenience of mid-heal. And as I tried to show with that example, using multiple of the same class is totally viable as well. Not having a physical attacker or only having physical attackers are both viable strategies as well. You can run away from the enemies you can't deal with and nothing of value is lost. And there are benefits, since if you're running only one physical attacker besides the hero, and I'll be honest, the hero stops doing well when it comes to physical attacks later on. If you're only attacking physically with one party member, that means applying Zap when only one party member can take advantage of it is a bit of a waste. Number 3. Defense can be lowered by 6 stages, meaning zap can be applied 3 times since it lowers defense by 2 stages. You don't cast it once and forget about it anymore. It seems like a huge investment, but there's a little trick to get more value out of it. In practice, it's often best to use zap twice, then wait a little, then use Kazap or Owachi Sword to lower the defense by only 1 stage, which refreshes the duration of the debuff. Then later on you can max it out. This makes you get basically 3 times the duration you would have gotten if you simply maxed it out, then waited for the stat decrease to run out and then used all 3 zaps again. It also makes you more flexible in who applies it past the first 2 casts, since anyone can use Owachi Sword. And the 6 stages aren't entirely correct. The amount of times that zap can be applied does seem to be higher when your wisdom is low. For example, here's a clip of a Damsa Brick Priest taking way more casts to reduce an enemy's defense. But the 3 zaps was easier to explain, and that's what you're working with most of the time. Number 4. You can tactically change tactics, since AI party members know things that you don't. If your healer goes last, this removes the guessing game from preemptive healing. If you don't know which spell is going to be effective against a boss, this lets your mage figure it out for you. The AI doesn't have any foresights. For the most part, you're better off playing for yourself. But switching to tactics is more than a lazy choice for when you don't wanna play yourself. But at this point, I want to point out that I'm never criticizing players for playing a certain way. And if you hold your opinion that you want to not think about it too much, use the default party and use them on default tactics. I'm not criticizing that either. I find it weird when people mention stuff like that under a discussion, saying they don't care about the discussion. But that doesn't bother me. What I want to criticize are not players, but the people that make videos where they regurgitate vague quote-unquote information that could be applied to any RPG. And there are good ones, especially ones for very basic mechanics that I would never want to bother explaining myself since I find that boring, but it's great that someone in the community is putting out those resources. But when it gets a little more advanced, the guides and explanation videos are unbelievably bad. One thing that bothers me is how reductive they are, which might seem like it makes sense. It's an okay trade-off to sacrifice some detail for ease of conveyance, especially in a beginner's guide that's necessary, since otherwise you run the risk of being overwhelming. I could have talked in detail about different status effects for a while longer, like how there are different messages depending on whether an enemy is immune or not, yet I didn't. But the difference is that almost all the guides I've seen so far are so reductive that they lose all meaning. If you take a more or less complex mechanic and completely discard it, if you don't explain it but instead just say do X, what's really the point? I think if you're trying to make a video that inherently seeks to inform and you boil down personalities to Vamp, formerly known as Sexy, is the best one, so use it and only it. Just because the total amount of stat growth increases are the highest in some, something by the way you got from reading a sheet and not from experience playing the game, I think that's insufficient. Number 5. Vamp is not the best personality. The best personality depends on a few factors, but I can give you a quick guide. By now the exact stats have been data mined, and while Vamp has been nerfed by a small amount, it has also indirectly been buffed. I'd say it's better than it used to be in the original, but it is still not the definitive be all and end all of the discussion. So to debunk the usual argument that Vamp is the best personality because it gives the highest sum of percentage increases to stats, I'm phrasing it like that because it isn't simply the one that gives you the most stats. That would usually be tough, bodybuilder, bad out of hell or lucky, depending on your class. So while Vamp gives you an average growth of 111.6% overall stats, and Tarth and Ironclad each only give 105 and 106.7% respectively, increasing a warrior's agility, for example, won't do all that much. I leveled up 2 warriors just for this bit. One was Tarth, one was Vamp and one was a bodybuilder. And I compared the stats at level 14. As you can see, the total stats are the highest on the Tarth one, even if the total percentage of stat increases was lower. And that is disregarding stat quality. Those extra points in wisdom and luck are borderline useless. Even if luck is not entirely useless and having more MP matters when abilities come into play. This, by the way, is why I said that Vamp has been indirectly buffed. Even so, I hope we can agree that having 10% more strength on someone whose main goal in life is punching monsters is worth way more than a slightly higher amount of MP. And the warrior is already bound to going last for the rest of their life. Changing their agility by a few points won't make or break them. This isn't supposed to be a full guide on personalities. I just want to point out that the ones that currently exist are bad. And that's normal. The game just came out and the quality of information is only going up from here. In one of these videos I even saw someone else clear up that seeds carry over between levels, something that was still being spread around everywhere on the first few days of the game's release. In a few weeks I look back on this video and think to myself that I could have inserted 100 even better tips that I simply didn't know of yet. And I'm currently working on a class guide, something that might take me a couple of months. I still need to do at least 4 or 5 playthroughs, which are probably 10 hours each to get a good grasp, but that one isn't out yet and it won't be for a while. And in the meantime, it's good when there's a search result, even if it's a bad one, since more important than the quality of information is that these videos help people to overcome their OCD, relax and start enjoying the game. Watching one makes you think that you aren't jumping into cold water, and if the information is bad, who really cares? I don't have anything against people who make bad guides. Seriously. I even think these videos have a right to exist, but I won't let that stop me from making a good one eventually, and I think I can point out bad advice without this being a personal attack. To a degree, I'm even building on what others already made. I can talk about bad advice and debunk it instead of having to give out entirely new tips of my own. So in a sense, I have a much easier task. Number 6 is about Postgame, so here's a spoiler warning. I will show how the bosses look and talk about some gameplay mechanics. So unlocking Postgame is pretty straightforward at the beginning. You go to the Dragon Queen's castle, do a bonus dungeon and then there's Zenlon. What you might have missed, which is why I'm mentioning it here, is that after you beat him and select a wish, there's a blank option, and if you select that one, you unlock even more postgame. This is boring to a lot of you, but I'd bet at least 2 people had their minds blown just now. So here are 2 tips for the Temple of Trials. The first one is how to beat the seemingly impossible swarm of Pandora's boxes. They have insane health, passively regenerate and spam Omni heal as well as Kerplunk dancers to revive one another. If you don't want to grind an insane amount, then the only real way of beating them is by using the Blasto spell. All the other Pandora's boxes are immune to Proof, Thwack and Blasto, but apparently these boxes aren't, so you can send them off. This also means that they won't be able to revive one another since they're not dead, just gone from the battle. And while I'm sure it's possible without, this helps a ton and makes it so you don't have to grind as much. So anyways, here's how to grind a bunch. And notice I didn't say I was giving you an efficient option for EXP grinding. I was giving you an option to grind a lot, which means yes, number 7 is AFK EXP grinding. In the Northeast Trial there's a looping hallway right at the start, so as long as you hold up you will indefinitely go in a straight line. You can then switch to the Draki quest difficulty, which is not only easy but guard mode, meaning you will never die in combat, even after running out of MP. Then switch all your party members to Show No Mercy, and then all that's left to get yourself an EXP farming setup is something that repeatedly selects the fight option if you do get into a battle. I personally used an auto clicker and moved my mouse over the fight option. And you need some contraption that holds up, which for me was just a rubber band around the joystick and the back of the controller. If there's some footage of my hero at level 90, that's how I did it. I don't think this will stay as the best way of AFK grinding for long, since this is literally the first thing I came up with after thinking to myself that I didn't want to grind. And with that, I think I had at least a few tips that are actually useful. I'll be honest, this whole video came from me seeing one too many bad guides and figuring that instead of making a video about how bad they are, I should instead make a better one. Despite that, I sure hope this video will age poorly and seem badly researched in comparison to whatever comes out a few weeks from now. So I was editing this video and guess what? It already aged badly. Specifically, the discussion surrounding personalities moved on and there's already been a few new articles and a few new videos. This is one of the downsides of doing research. I had to spend way too much time testing stuff, so now other aspects of this video are outdated. And while I was editing, the discussion moved. Not very far, but it did move significantly. One video that I want to use as an example for where we're at right now is this one right here. It's basically a one-to-one translation of Game 8's written out guide, which is better than trying to avoid the question your guide sets out to answer, even if Game 8 is not a greater resource when it comes to strategy advice. It doesn't mention Paragon or Bodybuilder, and there's other nitpicks, and I do believe Aquano could have better pointed out that the video is a translation of another guide. Instead, he stated that this is a mix of information he found on vague Japanese forums and his personal opinions, but I can't blame him for that. This isn't an individual problem, more a problem with our community being hostile. Since even if it's one of the better ones, this is still a gaming community. I think translating a site is noble work, and when it comes to how he presented it, well, there isn't really an alternative, now is there? And getting resources out quickly is great and has its place. What really matters is that the quality of information is already improving, regardless of where it comes from. If we can keep going at this rate, then maybe 2 years from now there won't even be any of the AI generated guides anymore.